Gordon in there to answer Joanna's question next.
Yes, I'm mindful of the time, so I'll try and do it as briefly as possible. Kirsty's touched on the deterrent effect that inconsistency and lack of clarity in the rules might deter people from getting involved in protests, and certainly anecdotally there's a great deal of evidence there. The other side of it, of course, is that, I mean, firstly, protest has never been banned. When it's been silent, protest is still, of course, allowed as common law right, enhanced, as it were, by the Human Rights Act. And the police have a duty to facilitate protest in these circumstances, regardless of what the regulations say. The issue that sort of has become very problematic is how restrictions are enforced, what restrictions are decided, and how the police go about doing that. We've talked about the 4 E's, the engage, explain, encourage, enforce. Well, there's a fundamental flaw there if officers don't actually understand what the regulations are. Who are you engaging with? Why? What are you explaining? What are you encouraging them to do? And ultimately, of course, when you're taking enforcement action, are you actually sure, or do you have a reasonable belief that somebody is acting contrary to the guidance? With the way with the regulations, there's the obvious slip: the guidance, the regulations. That has been a major issue, and some forces have treated protest as being banned, except during that time when protest was specifically exempt. And forces have also just got it wrong in general. And not to talk about sort of our own cases, but a case I had in August, prior to the new regulations in September, indicated that the Met Police had not really understood the regulations at all over the summer of the protests, when they threatened to arrest a client of mine who was seeking to organise a protest because they said he wasn't exempt, when actually he quite clearly was, which they eventually accepted after pre-litigation. So, without an understanding of what the regulations are, the police shouldn't be trying to enforce restrictions on protests. Protests that are, adhere to the guidance at least of, hands, face, space, as it were, should not have interference at all. And the police should be, because it's been, their duty to facilitate forever, as it were, and it's certainly been in the manuals for the last decade plus, that duty to facilitate, should be adept at facilitating that protest and focusing on public order, because they're not experts in public health. And unless there's an obvious breach of it, they shouldn't be getting involved. But that inconsistency across the country, different forces, has certainly been a problem. And I think that's why you've seen different approaches at different times. If we're going forward, we have this, there needs to be greater clarity about it, but there also needs to be an understanding from the police that their duty is to facilitate. Sorry.
And I'm conscious of the time, but I think the police would say at present, so far as they're concerned, and I'm talking about England only at the moment, the national lockdown was enacted by moving the whole of England into Tier 4 and strengthening restrictions, and protest is no longer permitted because there's no exemption for it. So if if more than 2 people are gathering outdoors, then that's against the law, and there's no exemption. There's an exemption for picketing, but not an exemption for protesting. I mean, if the police were to say that, what would your response be?
My response would be, and Gracie, please step in as well, particularly if I get it wrong. But my response would be, the courts have already accepted that a reasonable excuse to leave the house engages convention rights. That's in the Dolan case that went to the Court of Appeal. And there remains always this common law right to protest unless it's been specifically banned by the government. They have never specifically banned it. It therefore still exists. And the police's duty to facilitate it still exists. So it's a problem that it's not specifically exempted because it doesn't create that clarity. But the police, with their legal advisors, should by now understand the common law right to protest and their duty to